Hey, and welcome to Thought Atlas. It's just me again this week. There wasn't a video last week because, frankly, I wasn't feeling well. We didn't have anyone to come on, and I had a bunch of people coming over, and they changed my work schedule around. It was kind of a mess. So this week is the last week before the Libertarian National Convention in Reno, and even though the idea of this channel is to sort of explore ideas. Obviously, everyone on the channel right now is a libertarian, and so it's going to have a lean to it. The idea isn't necessarily for this channel to be the libertarian channel, but by request, I'm going to answer a question that someone had asked me who had seen the show, and that is why do I think that being a libertarian is important? Like, what is the purpose of libertarianism? What is sort of like my goals or the goals of the party or whatever? Um, I mean, you could look at it in a broad sense or a narrow sense. Like, a lot of the people right now that are in the process of taking over the Libertarian Party are in the Mises Caucus, named after Ludwig von Mises, and they have a significant focus on Austrian economics. And Austrian economics, though it is known for a great many things, is known mostly for essentially doing away with the labor theory of value and replacing it with the margin theory of value. And so the labor theory of value is that the labor that you put into a thing is what creates its value, right? So, and the margin theory of value goes a bit further. So the problem with the labor theory of value, of course, is that it doesn't matter if it takes you 100 hours to build a birdhouse, it's still a birdhouse. And if you can build a birdhouse in 2 hours, you need to justify the difference in cost. And even if you can, if there's a million birdhouses on sale and everyone already has one, it doesn't matter how much labor you put into it. So there's a disconnect there, right? Like, if you want to buy a bottle of water for $1, you will. If you want to buy 10 bottles of water for $10, you probably will. But at some point, there's enough bottles of water that your demand is satiated. And so if someone's like, do you want to buy 1 million bottles of water for $1 million? You're going to probably be like, well, I have enough water. If you sold me 1 million bottles of water for $10, like, maybe I'd take them. I don't know what I'm going to do with them all. Right? You might even get to a point where you're like, no, I'm not interested. I don't have anywhere to store them. And so that value changes. Like, if you're out in the desert and you're dying and someone's like, here's a bottle of water, but it'll cost you $10, and you only have $10, but like you're dying of thirst, you're probably going to buy that bottle of water. And so that's the marginal theory of value, or the margin theory of value, where there's more to it. Supply and demand plays a role. Market plays a role. Now, I like Austrian economics, but I don't necessarily think that, and like a lot of other libertarians seem to, that capitalism is the highest goal. I think liberty is the highest goal, and that in a sufficiently free society, the thing that we call capitalism becomes the best expression of that freedom, not an end in itself. And so, like, you could look, for example, to objectivism, which I'm particularly fond of. And I feel like objectivism is also a lot of times poorly understood. But there's an expression there, a quote, if you were to quote Ayn Rand, is that I live for no other man and ask that no other man lives for me. So the idea there is that you're completely and totally self-sufficient, independent. Now, that doesn't mean you won't ever do something for somebody else, or that doing something for someone else is necessarily wrong. The idea is that you don't expect someone to do something else for you. That when you do things for other people, that it's fundamentally going to be an exchange of some kind. Even if you are being charitable and saying, like, hey, like, here's $5, right? There's an exchange happening. You're doing that because maybe they're your friend and they need $5, and you've formed this relationship, and so there's an aspect of social capital there. And so you're helping them out, or maybe it's a stranger and it makes you feel good, or it satisfies some religious need. But in any case, you're always exchanging something for something. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. Like, you're not going to just walk into your kitchen, grab a dinner plate, walk down the street like 4 houses, pick out some kid on a skateboard and say, here's a dinner plate, right? Like that doesn't benefit you, it doesn't benefit him. That exchange is so illogical that the idea that you might even consider it hasn't crossed your mind, right? And so there's this idea that when you have an idea to do something, even if it's a charitable act, it comes from some need, some desire to either better your own condition directly, or to better the condition of society through an act. Like if you go out and you want to participate in a charity to help feed homeless people, right? Like you could say, well, if we can get these people's basic needs met, maybe crime goes down. But the important thing is that this has to be an act that comes from you, the individual. It can't be something that you demand of other people. You can't go and say, well, I want homelessness to go down, so I'm going to demand that everyone pays for this program, right? That's where you're starting to say that you require the labor of others. And you could expand this further and get into like positive and negative rights. So like the idea of a positive right is that you can demand to have something, and a negative right is that you have the assurance that something won't be taken from you. And so when people are out there and they say something like, well, healthcare is a right, well, healthcare requires the action of others, and so you're demanding something of someone. And so I would say that positive rights don't exist because they require the actions of others. And a good way to test that something is a positive right is to imagine that there's only two people left on Earth. And I don't mean like a man and a woman. I mean, it could be like any two people. It could be two women or two men, or like a child and an old lady or whatever, right? Well, do you still have health care? If your other person is injured and dying, and to stop and save them kills you, is it a right for them to have that health care? Do they get to demand that you die, or that you divert resources that would go to surviving to help them? Or if you're separated, you fall over in a cave, like you're not going to have somebody to come and get you. So that's a positive right. You're demanding the labor of others. And even when you get into something like taxes, right? Taxes, if your tax rate is 25%, you could say that on one hand, oh well, it's just contributing, but really it's saying that 25% of the time that you're doing labor, that time belongs to somebody else. And so it might not, it's kind of like the Rick and Morty joke. It's like slavery with extra steps. It means a quarter of your day belongs to someone else, to do what somebody else wants, to meet the demands made by other people. And in one of the counter arguments you hear from people is like, well, we voted for this. Well, a lot of the programs that exist now, a lot of these like social, whether it's even welfare or it's something that you don't consider welfare, like the education system or whatever, a lot of those things were voted for by people that are either very old or dead at this point. So it's like I never got to vote on it. I never got to have a say in it. I didn't get to participate when they decided to create an income tax or a property tax. So why am I beholden to the decision that these previous people made for me, essentially? Why is it that a portion of my time is being given to somebody else instead of being used productively and selectively? And this is part of the problem when you get into government programs, right? Government programs don't discriminate. And when I say that, I don't mean in a racial sense. I mean in a moral sense. Like the heroin addict is just as eligible for that care as, an 18-year-old that got kicked out of their house, right? And even saying, oh, it's this 18-year-old that got kicked out of their house, well, that's not giving you enough personal information about them to decide if giving them money is a good idea or not. Like maybe they're a terrible person. Like maybe they were constantly attacking their siblings or something, right? And so when you have charitable organizations that are able to use discrimination to say, okay, this is a worthy cause, this is an efficient cause, this is a person who is easily able to be rehabilitated, you are efficiently allocating resources, and you're doing it in a way that is satisfying a need or a demand. rather than simply scattershot for the supposed betterment of everyone, because no one has enough information to make that decision like unilaterally. And that's one of the things the market does well. So I know this is kind of so to get back to the main point, the purpose of the Libertarian Party is essentially to maximize freedom, but the things that are freedom are, I think, often these days getting obfuscated through political rhetoric, right? Like having healthcare isn't freedom. Like someone saying, well, everyone should have healthcare so you're more free. Well, no, that's the opposite, because you're demanding that a lot of this effort go into healthcare instead of to other services. And the way the government operates is essentially you're going to have this cost-saving pressure because they're only obligated to meet sort of the basic requirements. They're not obligated to compete and improve on their services against other people. Now, some of that could be eliminated through competition, but the benefit to a politician isn't through providing a better service, it's through getting reelected. And if their only job was to provide healthcare, then maybe they would have a vested interest in making sure that it's the best. But their profit isn't coming from customers. Their profit is coming from tax revenue, which isn't directly connected to that service. And of course, we don't live in a world where that's their only obligation. They have a whole bunch of other obligations. And so they'll never focus on something that they're tasked with doing as much as someone whose livelihood depends on it. And through and recognizing that and understanding why that makes private businesses important and government interference detrimental is the difficult battle that libertarians have to fight, because it requires more than one step of thinking, where most people kind of stop at the, well, I want healthcare, so I'm going to vote for this. And they don't really get how that isn't going to provide them with the best outcome. And what's funny is you'll hear that all the time, especially from the left, and especially from the like online like communist left, where they say, why do people vote outside of their own interests? Like, why won't they just vote for the communists? Well, it's because that's not necessarily in their best interest. I would say it's absolutely not in their best interest for the very reasons that I just said. But even if you were to get really basic and just talk Democrat and Republican, right? Like, what does the government do for the average like person who lives in the countryside? They show up and tell them what they're not allowed to do. You can't have that vehicle, it uses too much fuel. You can't use your land this way because some environmental regulation. We're going to take your money to build sidewalks and schools for the inner city, which you don't live in and never see. We're going to raise your property taxes, and because you live in the countryside where your property is less desirable, you're going to end up paying a significantly larger portion of taxes. And so when you're out in the middle of nowhere, the government is very adversarial. Like there's a joke that, everyone talks about, BLM is fighting for minorities. BLM is a terrorist organization. BLM is trying to redistribute justice. And then you have like libertarians being like, the Bureau of Land Management is a terrorist organization. Of course, the joke is, of course, they're talking about a different BLM, but the focus should always be, when you're dealing with the government, on what is the government doing, and usually it's nothing good, and it's not always because they intend to do bad, but the nature of how they allocate resources is completely divorced from the jobs that they're doing 90% of the time, and so they'll almost always inevitably fail at providing a better service than a private organization. And so helping people have freedom where they can go and educate their children the way they want to, where they can engage in commerce the way they want to, where you can start a small businesses, because you see this all the time in business regulations, where the companies that are lobbying for them are giant companies who they'll seemingly affect the most. But those companies are large enough that they can foot the bill for whatever cost there is associated with doing the compliance, right? So it's like, well, if every time someone engages with your app, you have to go and do a background check, like something ridiculous like that, right? The big companies are going to be able to afford that, and the small company, the small startup, that's going to just destroy their margins to the point where they can't even enter the market. And then you end up with these giant monopolies like we see today. And then everyone goes, oh, well, capitalism bad. And it's like, well, it's not. Well, first of all, I always argue that capitalism doesn't really exist. Capitalism arrives out of having a sufficient amount of freedom, especially economic freedom. But, you know, they say capitalism bad. Well, that's not really what capitalism is. Like, I put together a meme the other day. I'm going to pull it up here, where it capitalizes the letters that spell capitalism, but the words are all the things that you need to have capitalism: contracts, property rights, voluntary exchange, self-ownership, free association, and markets. And so if you're out there and you're saying, well, we need to get rid of capitalism, okay, well, how is your society going to function without contracts where people actually have to follow through on the things that they promise each other? And we're like, well, that doesn't work. Okay, well, what about property rights? And like, well, you shouldn't be able to own the means of production. Okay, fine. But how is that different from private property? What if you, on your private property, want to do build a bicycle or fix your car? Well, you're producing something. You're taking a material, which could be your broken car, and you're applying labor to it. And so now you've increased the value. You've produced a functional car out of a broken car. And so you've added value, therefore you're being productive. So now your house garage is the means of production, or the hammer that you used. Like, that's ridiculous to think that. Then you end up setting an arbitrary threshold at what point it becomes the means of production, and then what, right? Then the government controls it, and we've already established that the government does not do its job properly when it comes to allocating resources because of the nature of how democracy works. And so, you know, that leaves them with, do you dissolve democracy, or do you give up on this idea that the government can control the entire economy from the top down? Right? What's next? Voluntary exchange, right? Well, that's an instant loss for the people who don't want capitalism, because they want people to be able to have community, and you can't have community if you can't interact with your community and exchange things voluntarily, right? Like, if you have to involve a middleman, then it's not really a community. Self-ownership, you know, oh, well, they'll say, my body, my choice. Well, if that's the case, then why is it your body? Why isn't it our body, right? So self-ownership, they won't give that up. Free association, you should be able to be friends with or not friends with people you want. Do you want the so-called fascists or Nazis, as you describe everyone right of Karl Marx, to be in your communist utopia? No, you want to disassociate with those people. So they won't give up free association. And then last but not least, markets, right? And this would be the one that some of the more hardline ones will be willing to get rid of, but for the most part, this isn't where the communist movement is anymore. And they don't want to give up markets either. They're like, well, no, you should be able to, like, if you make something, if you create a piece of art or a YouTube video or something, you should be able to sell it or whatever. And so they won't give up markets either. And so, okay, well, if you won't give up any of these things, and all of these things end up producing capitalism, then you're not really a communist, are you? You've lost on all of these points. So give up. So yeah, but I guess that's my point. So to summarize, to go back to why is libertarianism important? Well, because it puts actual liberty forward. It understands the more complex things about, you know, why is it more free for people to pay less taxes? Why is it more free for private companies to provide healthcare instead of the state? Why is it more free for us to be able to own guns? Or why is it more free? And one of the things too, I guess, just while it's on my mind, is people like to think of, like, well, the libertarians are like a centrist party, or they're neither left or right. Well, they definitely aren't left or right, and in the past they've tried to operate as a centrist party, but they're an other. We're very different. Like, when you look at, for example, gay marriage, you had the Republicans saying, well, no, it should be between a man and a woman, and the government saying, no, it should be recognized between anybody. Well, the libertarian position, even though it's functionally similar to the it should be between anybody, our position is it shouldn't be any business of the state at all. Like marriage is a religious institution, it's none of the state's business, period. Right? That's not the same as saying the state should recognize. It's saying the state should go fuck off and do its own thing and not concern itself with the culture of its citizens unless the citizens are threatening to dismantle the framework that allows for that freedom, which is what the online left is certainly trying to do. And it's seeping into the Democrat Party because the Democrat Party has essentially lost touch with its base. And the more they lose touch with its base, the more you get these left-wing extremists in who want things that would scare our parents. And I don't think a lot of the older Democrats understand what's coming. Now, I'm not as concerned with the libertarians taking over over the Republicans or Democrats. I'd be just as happy if we were able to completely infiltrate and corrupt a party and then transform it into essentially what is libertarianism. But for now, I'm in the proper Libertarian Party because the Republicans are just as bad. Well, maybe not just as bad. Well, they're just as bad as the Democrats that are in power now, but they're a lot better than the leftists that want to become in the power. And so you can see a little bit of this with like Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being significantly worse than most of the rest of the Democrats. But the Republicans aren't great either. Like, Trump let the lockdowns happen. Trump let them suspend the debt ceiling. Trump issued the rounds of checks to everybody. He didn't get rid of the he let them renew the Patriot Act, so he didn't get rid of the Patriot Act. So he did a lot of things that weren't great either, but they weren't as wacky and ridiculous as the left. Like, he put in the bump stock ban. I have a whole list somewhere. I don't have it in front of me. I probably should have. I didn't really know where I was going to go with today's episode. So, and I've been off my ADHD medicine because it ran out and my doctor doesn't know how to, well, it's either the doctor or the pharmacy where one of them doesn't know how to use their prescription system to renew things. Where like, I'll call them, I'll tell them, and then a week later, both of them are like, I don't see it in the system. Like, they didn't file it. We didn't get it. We sent it back. We didn't get it. Like, I'm like, I sent both of them a message. Like, guys, sort it out or I'm getting rid of both of you. I don't care anymore. Just figure it out. There's plenty of doctors and there's plenty of pharmacies. And that's the thing is that's where choice comes into play. I'm not going to sit here and whine and say, well, they need new regulations and make sure that this is done, or someone with a gun is going to show up and make sure it works. No, I'm just going to say, okay, well, I'm going to go to UPMC. I'm going to go to CVS. Like, you guys lose. Right? And people need to do that more. Like, if you don't like Amazon, don't shop there. You're going to pay more to go somewhere else. But eventually, that'll change things, right? I guess that's it. I wore one of my new shirts. I got a bunch of black and gold shirts for libertarian purposes, but also because I live in Pittsburgh, and so it's double purpose. Like, if I show up to a Steelers game with this, or a Penguins game or something, no one's gonna question it. They're not gonna be like, "Why are you wearing those colors?" And so that's one of the things. So all the libertarians, forget New Hampshire, move to Pennsylvania, particularly to Western Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, because we've already got like the black and gold thing going on. So, you save money on apparel, and that's very important economically. So if you're like a fan of capitalism, but you're also a fan of efficiency, that's my advice to you: is all the libertarians come here to Pittsburgh, and we'll make everything amazing. Right? It's in Pennsylvania where the country was started by people who would effectively have been libertarians today. Like, I was telling to someone, I'm kind of getting into anecdotes now, but I was saying to somebody, like, Trump was like a 34 out of 100. It's just that most presidents are like between 12 and like 25 out of 100. And so, like, yeah, he's a lot better than what we've had recently. We haven't had like a solid 100 since like Benjamin Franklin or something. You know, even when you get to Lincoln, what Lincoln accomplished in the outcome is great, right? Like, nobody wants slavery. Slavery bad. But he also suspended large portions of the Constitution in order to make that happen, right? And it's like, even when you like, oh, we defeated COVID. Well, you did it by destroying people's livelihoods, suspending the Constitution, handing vast powers over to the government. Like, that's not a win. Right? I mean, and we haven't even defeated COVID. At least he actually managed to get rid of slavery for the most part. So, but Lincoln maybe like a 60 out of 100. Yeah, so I would say go with the Libertarians, because especially like even if you were like, well, I'm just gonna vote Republican or I'm just gonna vote Democrat anyway, just changing your registration has them lose numbers and they freak out, right? And then someday, even if you're not actually voting for Libertarians and you're just registered as one, someday someone's going to point out like, hey, the Libertarians actually have like as many registered members as other parties, and then we can actually pose an extremely serious threat to the status quo. And so you can be just happy voting Democrat or voting Republican or whatever you prefer. If you're liberty minded, you don't want to give up, your candidates. You don't have to, right? You can still vote for Rand Paul. You can still vote for Trump, and if you register Libertarian, you help push back against that system, because now the Republicans are like, we're losing people to the Libertarians. Like, we needed to do something about this, and so they're going to adopt more Libertarian policies to try to get those voters over to their side, and then you end up subsuming that party, absorbing its values and replacing them. Well, not absorbing its values. You end up outdating the values that you don't like and pushing the ones that you do like to the top. And then they're forced to essentially adopt your values in order to win elections. All right. And so there's some seemingly meaningless things you can do that actually mean a whole lot. For the most part, I'm going to vote for probably Libertarians across the board, except for in like the highest up places where they're absolutely not going to win, right? Where like if it comes to like the governor or the president, or even in most cases a senator, I'll probably pick the Republican unless it's a particularly bad Republican at the moment. But if it was a Republican from like 2002, I wouldn't be voting for them, where they're trying to like put evolution in schools and like ban gay marriage and saying that like certain books like Harry Potter and magic cards are evil and we need to ban video games because of violence. Like, yeah, I'm not going to vote for that Republican. But currently they're like, I don't know, maybe we should drill for oil before gas becomes $10 a gallon. Like, oh yeah, I'm going to vote for that. Like, screw off with your stupid environmental nonsense, Democrats. If you really want to make a change, then like go after China for their pollution, which is way worse than ours. Because there's statistics involved where they'll say, well, U.S. pollutes more than anybody else, but we also produce more than everyone else. If you start looking at like what we're actually producing and how we manage that pollution, like we don't have like rivers, or we don't have like rivers and algae that glow at night that becomes a tourist attraction because it's so polluted that drinking the water would kill you, right? Like, we actually handle our environmental impact significantly better, even if we produce more of it technically, like when you total up like tonnage per individual, right? And so, whining that you don't drive an electric car yet, why haven't you spent $70,000 on an electric car, isn't going to help anybody. And stealing money off of people to make people drive electric cars isn't helping anybody either. They've just, and that's like the Democrats that are in power. Like, to anyone who's listening to this that isn't involved online, like if you're just a regular Democrat, like go listen to some absolute wingnut like Vosh or something for like 5 minutes and just see if you don't pull your hair out. which might be bad advice because he lies and skews things and is a relativist. So, he'll say this is a fact and pull up some extremely cherry picked information. And if you're gullible to that kind of thing, you might end up being like, oh, but he gave me these facts about how, the right is evil. Well, if you go in knowing that's what's going on, or do your own research, or counter it with alternatives and then compare and contrast, you'll find that yeah, he's basically full of crap. And then even in areas where he's right, see the first half of this video where it's like, well, okay, so you can prove that you have a greater outcome, but what are you giving up in the process? Who are you taking money from in the process? Who are you relying on? Who are you? How is it that you think the government is going to do this better than anybody else? Right. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I've been rambling for half an hour now. I thought this was gonna be like a 10-minute video. All right. Well, see you guys later. Bye.